Rushanara, please.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. I wanted to talk some more about regulation, but ahead of that, just a few follow-ups. Gayon Hart, you were saying that fraud is incredibly complex, and we've heard a lot about educating the public. But you, as an expert, are talking about the complexity of it. Do you think that all of you, as companies, are engaged in what could be described as a cop-out by using that as your answer to some of the questions we've heard today? And should you not be, just as we've seen after the financial crisis with banks being expected to know their customer, that you should be proactively paying for the cost of the fraud that your companies, each of your companies, may be engaged in? We've seen some examples. Now, all of us recognise the powerful positive benefits of the internet and the opportunities that has presented. There's no question of that. We need to make sure we clean up the acts where it's going badly wrong, because otherwise it poisons the environment within which our citizens have to operate.
There's a number of parts to that question.
Yes.
I think the essence for us is that we would obviously challenge the fact that we enable fraud. We are the front line, we are the first line of defence for fraud, and that's where we focus our proactive controls. Secondly, I think you're absolutely right with the education and awareness point. It's one of the elements that I think has actually demonstrated that there's an increase in reporting, we hope, that is coming out. And one of the things I love about sort of Amazon's sort of guidance and tools and things that we provide is essentially that instead of we add to the Take 5 message which says, watch out, there are frauds, be careful. And what we do is we have a number of guides, and we've given some examples to the clerk, where it actually gives people a chance to empower themselves before they become a victim, that it recognises...
So I've heard what you've said about the positives. So where there are areas of improvement, what's your view if your company, obviously if your company isn't responsible for fraud that then takes place on top of what you've done, in terms of meeting the gaps, is there a case for all of your companies who inadvertently, shall we say, enable fraud to happen on your platforms, to actually be fined by regulators, in effect, in parallel, as a parallel to what happened through, for instance, things like de-risking of banks, where banks cleaned up their act because they knew they were going to be fined hundreds of millions of pounds. In fact, in some cases, much more.
They did, and actually de-risking was an example where it led to over-de-risking.
Precisely,
and
that's
so
my
the
point,
fines actually led the other way.
Okay, so
this
the
is
reason why I'm raising this,
yeah.
and I've raised some of the concerns around de-risking, is that isn't it time, you're talking about self-regulation and doing all the things that you're doing, isn't it time that as institutions you stepped up so that didn't happen? Because none of us want to see inappropriate regulation, but we don't want excuses, and we don't want our constituents continuing to suffer. And that's where we are, I'm afraid, so far. And the reality is, I'm afraid, with Google's made a mockery of the regulator of this country by expecting the regulator to take down fraudulent stuff on the site and have to pay for it. And yet, you're talking about entering into a dialogue and discussion, not straight answers at why on earth Google is not paying back the money that the regulator had to pay in order to take stuff off your site that you should be responsible for.
I would go back to, we're not waiting for regulation. We want to keep users safe on our platform. We find it abhorrent that anyone is falling victim to a scam. And so we have taken extensive measures to make sure that users are safe when they use it.
I suppose what I'm saying is, if a bank did that, if the bank expected, if the FCA had to pay for banks' failures, I think we'd be up in arms. And yet your company, and I'm a big fan of Google, we're all dependent on Google. Right? It's lots of good things happen in our constituency, so there's no question of that. But your company has put the FCA, the regulator of this country, in an embarrassing situation where, in effect, it's a joke what's happened, that the regulator has had to pay you in order to take down stuff that you shouldn't have put in there in the first place. So my question is, should the legal requirement now be placed on you, each one of you, where you are proactively required to make sure this stuff never sees the light of day? Isn't that where the regulation should be?
We've collaborated very closely with the FCA over the last 2 years. I've met with Charles and Nikhil myself multiple times.
Should it be enshrined in law? Because otherwise we're relying on your goodwill and embarrassment and bad coverage, media coverage and reputational damage for you to possibly get there, because it's taken a long time.
So we're not shy of taking action here at all. We've put in place the verification scheme against the Financial Services, Financial Conduct Authority's verification list. Just to give you another example of where we take extreme measures to protect user safety, when COVID was first playing out, we actually banned all COVID-related adverts across all of our surfaces. We got extensive criticism from businesses and from governments for that move, but we didn't feel we could serve COVID ads at that stage in a safe way, and so we took all of them down. We're not shy of taking those sorts of actions to make sure users are safe, and that's why we've put in place the certification scheme that we have, and we've taken multiple other actions.
But from an industry-wide issue, there'll be variances in what's happening and who's doing what and who's doing good work and who isn't, notwithstanding all the different working groups you've established. And what we need is outcomes. So I'll give you a parallel example. Counterterrorism and online hate. So a few years back, and my constituent, I had constituency experience where Facebook and other social media platforms were being used by extremist groups, and then the then government intervened because the police were having to take down stuff and report stuff that's online that was extremely harmful and being used to groom young people to become extremists. And the same has happened on religious extremism and far-right extremism. Lots of progress has been made there. Can we learn from that? Because it seems to me that because financial fraud is often seen as victimless, actually, in terms of the narrative, and we've heard lots of people talk about it in that way, and it is not victimless, that the same level of effort isn't being put into financial fraud and what's being hosted by social media sites and sites that many of you host, and that's what needs to happen, so that you can it's automatically done and you're putting the investment in and you're legally required to do so, because otherwise we're going to get varying practices. And you've heard from Alison Thulis about the number of things that are there that people have to navigate, which is almost impossible because the public is bombarded with stuff. And if a company can't get a grip, how do you expect our constituents to get a grip and get a handle on any of this? Would anyone else, feel free to come in, but would anyone else like to come in on this point? Facebook? Maybe it's time for Facebook to come in.
I don't have too much to add. And again, it's a public policy point, but I do think that we would call for content regulation, and we do want to see proportionate regulation in this space.
You would agree with content regulation?
We would agree with content regulation. We're waiting to see what the online safety bill, what the outcome of this online safety bill is. We agree with proportionate regulation in this matter.
So then, can I ask others if you would just on platform, whether there should be content regulation and legal responsibility for preventing content from appearing on your sites that's enshrined in law? Would anyone else like to come in on that? To add anything on that?
I would just comment again that we're not waiting for regulation.
That's not the question, with respect. Would you agree with legislation that requires you to? We appreciate what you're doing proactively, but some would argue that because there's been a lot of attention on this committee at what you've done with FCA and made a mockery of the FCA, that you've put in those changes in time ahead of this committee. We welcome it, but it's public pressure that's often, and media pressure, that leads companies to take action. So what's the answer to the question?
So the change that we made with the FCA certification...
No, sorry. Would you support regulation? The question that Alison was able to answer in a straightforward way. Could you answer that question? Do you support regulation to prevent online platforms taking legal responsibility to prevent content appearing on your site?
It's ultimately, in our view, up for the government to decide.
No, but the question is, what's your view as a company, given you're the company, with respect, that has acted in a frankly appalling way where the regulator has had to pay you to take stuff off when you've been responsible for hosting material on your sites that are fraudulent.
So what the FCA has been doing is education, using our services to contact users. And
that's not my question, with respect. My question was, do you support regulation to address this particular point? And you're not answering it. Yes or no?
So we share your concern.
Why don't you answer the question? It sounds like it's a no. It's absolutely perfectly respectable position if it's a no, but we need to know the answer.
We don't think the online safety bill is the right vehicle for regulation, so we're happy to engage in the online advertising review.
So I just have one more question for Facebook, for Alison. You, in 2018, and this is related to other aspects, just to give, I think that when we talk about fraud and financial crime, we need to look at where we're coming from, and that's why I'm drawing parallels with what's happened with terrorism and far-right crime and hate. And there has been good work, but unfortunately, very serious things have had to happen before work has been done to mitigate damage to institutions like Facebook. Facebook, when it started, was a force for positive and good. Many of us used for Facebook for our own work, but sadly, it's become synonymous with very negative things too, including fake news, including hate crime, including hosting stuff that is around terrorism. In 2018, the UN fact-finding mission into the investigation into the genocide by Yan He Lee on Myanmar against Rohingya Muslims concluded that Facebook played a determining role in that genocide, and that, in her words, Facebook turned out to be what was not intended. It's turned into some kind of a beast. Now, we need to make sure that regulation is established in such a way that these platforms that are a force for good, generally, are not used for hate crime and for inciting violence, and in this case, contributing to genocide. That's the that's the level of damage at its worst platforms can do. So what should be done at an international level to make sure that Facebook is never associated with genocide and other crimes?
Right. So we make clear in our standards that we don't allow any sort of criminal organizations to have a presence on Facebook. We remove all praise, support, and representations of organizations when we become aware of it, and we're continuing to invest in artificial intelligence to help improve this enforcement. And so we're continuing to look at it, and we're continuing to invest in these in this type of enforcement to make sure that that does not happen.
And how much in monetary terms are you investing? We've heard from Amazon about how much they've invested. You mentioned some numbers. Could you just clarify how much you're investing in preventing fraud, but also preventing hate crime and extremism and genocide in your case?
So I don't actually have a specific number specific to that. I did, as I referenced to earlier, we have 40,000 people who are working on safety and security. We've invested $13 billion in teams and technology in this area since 2016.
Thank you very much.